Hi and welcome to the second in a series of exam question walkthroughs for the AQA GCSE history exam. This section is on America between 1920 and 73, which features on paper 1 of the exam. So the first question you'll get in this section of the exam paper is a 4-mark question where you're asked to look at two interpretations of an event or a person. So in this case, the event is about working at Ford in America in the 1920s. So for this question, you will be required to spend about 5 minutes to write one paragraph, and you do not need any of your own knowledge. And that's really, really important. The question is asking you to read the two interpretations and to think about how those interpretations differ about X event, in this case working at Ford, and you are to explain your answer based on what it actually says in the interpretations. You do not need any of your own knowledge. So the very first thing that you would do would be to actually read the interpretations, and feel free to write on the exam question the sources booklet, to underline anything. Pick out what the key things are that are different in the two interpretations. So, for example, does one argue for something, whereas the other one argues against something? Is one positive about something, whereas one is negative about something? And remember, in your answer, because you're comparing, you really want to use connectives like whereas or however. Now, if you look at these two interpretations about working in Ford and read these carefully, it clearly says in one interpretation, in A, that working for Ford was a dream, that he was like a god, that everything ran like clockwork, that he was paid really well. Whereas the other one says that Ford kind of ruled out of fear, and he would employ people to beat employees up for anybody stepping out of line. So your answer, as I said, only requires one paragraph. And all you need to do is just literally compare the two interpretations and make sure you outline how they are different. And again, you'll see here in the structure format that I've used whereas as my connective. So interpretation A and B differ because A says this, whereas B says this. And if you're to look at the model answer here, you can see that I've pointed out two main differences here. So interpretations A and B differ about working at Ford because the writer of A says that as a worker at Ford, he was paid well, that he was proud to work there, whereas the writer of interpretation B says that working at Ford was unpleasant because workers were beaten by thugs employed by Ford if they stepped out of line. And then what's highlighted in red there just highlights a second difference. The second question that you will get on the America section is about the same two interpretations, but this time, instead of asking how the interpretations are different, the question is asking why might they be different? So why might one writer say that working at Ford was positive, whereas the other writer might say that working at Ford was negative? Again, this question only requires 5 minutes and one paragraph, but you will need to use some of your own knowledge and context to help you understand why there might be a difference. So you really need to look at who has written the interpretation and what their background is. Is there a reason why they're saying what they're saying? When was the interpretation written, and what impact might that have? Where does the interpretation come from? So a particular country, a particular standpoint, what impact does that have? And again, you still need to use the connectives whereas or however, because you're still comparing. So if you were to look at interpretations A and B in this case, you'll see that interpretation A was written by somebody who was a real loyal production worker himself, interviewed many years later. As a production worker, you need to think about perhaps would he have full knowledge of what was going on? Is there a reason why he might not be telling the whole truth about what was happening? And then interpretation B is written by a reporter. Therefore, what might his purpose be in writing? Might he perhaps want to sensationalise, to create a story about what it was like to work at Ford? The format is very similar to question 1. So interpretations A and B differ in their view about working at Ford because, and you're talking about the provenance. The provenance of A is this writer, whereas the provenance of B is this writer. And it's really important that you don't just state A was a production worker, B was a reporter, but why is that important? Why might that affect what they write? And so you'll see the model answer here. So interpretations A and B differ in their view about working at Ford because the provenance of A is a loyal worker who was paid well and who experienced the clockwork production of mass production at Ford, whereas the provenance of interpretation B is from a journalist who may want to sensationalise and be controversial in order to sell more books. And then there's a second point made highlighted blue. The third question also relates to the same two interpretations, but this question is worth 8 marks, and it's asking you which interpretation gives the more convincing opinion about working at Ford. And for this answer, because it's 8 marks, you will need about 10 minutes. You will write 2 paragraphs, and you will need to use your own knowledge again. Because really what this question is asking you is, using your historical facts, what would you use to support or challenge each author's view? So you need to write about both interpretations in turn before coming to a really brief concluding statement about which interpretation fits best with what you know about the history of this topic. Do not refer to provenance at all in your answer. You do not need to talk about provenance in this question at all. All the question is asking you is which interpretation is most historically accurate. So to answer this question, you will say in your first paragraph, in some ways, interpretation A is convincing, and then you'll give your own historical evidence. In contrast, in some ways, interpretation B is convincing, and you'll give your historical evidence before coming to a brief conclusion. So you'll see here that I've done a model answer for interpretation A for you. So in some ways, interpretation A is convincing because it is true that Ford introduced a new method of production. He introduced the assembly line, which meant that cars could be made quicker and cheaper in his plant. Ford's assembly line used an electric conveyor belt that carried the partly assembled cars past workers who did 1 or 2 jobs repeatedly, such as fitting wheels or doors. And therefore, you could argue that it did run like clockwork, as the interpretation says. In addition, Ford was known for paying his workforce nearly 3 times the wages paid at other factories. And so it's true that workers at Ford were paid well. And he did this in order to keep the skilled mechanics that he needed. He also established a shorter 5-day working week. And so therefore, interpretation A is convincing about the positive aspects about working at Ford. You will then replicate and do the same thing for interpretation B before coming to a brief summary conclusion. Question 4 is a 4-mark describe question. So again, it's a 5-minute question, 1 paragraph, and of course, as you're describing, you will need to use your own knowledge. In this case, the example question is describe 2 problems in the American economy that contributed to the Wall Street crash. So you must write about 2 different problems. So name the problem and then give a little bit of historical factual information from your own knowledge. But it's really tempting to write lots for this question and get carried away. Keep your information succinct and to the point. So the first problem in the American economy that contributed to the Wall Street crash was. The second problem in the American economy that contributed to the Wall Street crash was. So for example, the first problem was that there were inequalities of wealth. Not all Americans could afford the goods that factories produced, and there was a limit to the number of goods that people could buy. So therefore, American companies were overproducing and therefore profits began to fall. The second problem faced was that companies struggled to sell their goods abroad because foreign governments had put up tariffs in relation to the American tariffs. You might remember the Ford and McCumber Act. And as a result, America sold less goods abroad, and this hit American companies hard. So you can see I've outlined the problem and I've given a little bit of historical factual information behind that. The next question on the America topic is another 8-mark question, and it's an explain question where you're asked in what ways. Again, 10 minutes because it's 8 marks, 2 paragraphs, and you will need to use your own knowledge. So the example question here is, in what ways did the lives of some American women change in the 1920s? So in this answer, you will have to explain how a particular group of people experienced changes due to events or government decisions. And you'll need to write about 2 ways in which their lives changed. And you'll need to explain that with quite a bit of historical factual information. So the first way that the lives of some American women changed in the 1920s was. The second way that the lives of some American women changed in the 1920s was. The difference between this question and the describe question, which you might think looks similar here, is the amount of detail that's required. It is an 8-mark question, so you will need quite a bit of historical depth to your answer. You can see from the model answer that I present here that the paragraphs are quite a bit bigger. There's a lot more information required. So the first way that the lives of some American women changed was that women began to lead much less restricted lives. So before the First World War, women's lives were really restricted. They couldn't vote. They were expected to behave in a very reserved way. Poorer women also had to settle for poorly paid jobs, such as cleaning and low-skilled factory jobs. Once the First World War happened, though, women took over the jobs of fighting men, and therefore the money they earned gave them a sense of independence. By 1929, there were around 25% more women in paid employment than there had been in 1920. And that was consolidated by the fact that in 1920, they also received the right to vote, which would mean they could now make more of their own decisions. The second way in which the lives of some American women changed in the 1920s was that once they had this money of their own, women's social lives then changed. So instead of being reserved and wearing sensible clothing, women now started to take more risks, to live alone. The divorce rate doubled during the 1920s because women were becoming more independent. In addition, some women, particularly younger women, middle-class women, women in the cities, began to wear more revealing clothes, went on dates unchaperoned, and smoked and drank in public. And therefore, women's social attitudes changed alongside their ability to earn their own money. However, the social attitudes wouldn't necessarily have changed without the ability to earn their own money. The last question that you will get on the America topic is a 12-mark essay question. And this is a question where you will be given 2 bullet points to help you answer a question. This question, being 12 marks, will take you about 15 minutes to answer, should be 3 paragraphs, and you will need quite a bit of your own knowledge. You will be required to write quite a lot in depth from your own knowledge. So in this case, the example question is, which of the following made America a better, fairer society? Kennedy's New Frontier or Johnson's Great Society? And you must explain your answer with reference to both events. So the question really leads you into the structure of your answer. You will need to write 3 paragraphs, 1 paragraph about each of the bullet points, and then a conclusion in a 3rd paragraph. You must really make sure that you read the question carefully. You must plan your essay first. Before you even start writing, you must be clear in your own mind which of those things is the most important. In this case, did make America a better, fairer society? Do you think that it was Kennedy's policies around his New Frontier or Johnson's policies around his Great Society? Please don't flip-flop in your arguments, change your mind halfway through your essay. Plan at the beginning which you think is the most important, and then follow that through in your essay. And then once you've decided, there are 2 versions for how you can write this essay. In version 1, you can say that if you're writing about Kennedy's New Frontier was the more important factor because, and then you will give your evidence. Your second paragraph would be, admittedly, Johnson's Great Society did contribute, and then your conclusion. Or If you think that it was Johnson's Great Society that was the most important, you would start your essay, admittedly, Kennedy's New Frontier was an important factor, was in this case a big reason why America became a better, fairer society. But Kennedy's New Frontier was a more important factor because, and then in conclusion. So here's our model answer. So admittedly, Kennedy's New Frontier tried to make America a better, fairer society, but it had limited success. So the examiner can see straight away that this person thinks that Johnson's Great Society had more of an impact on making America a better, fairer society. But we know we have to still explain why Kennedy's New Frontier was important. So why was that? Well, Kennedy supported the civil rights movement. He gave important government jobs to African Americans. He set up the CEEO, which ensured that all people employed with the federal government had equal employment opportunities. But we know that the CEEO only helped those who already had a government job and didn't actively try and help any of those African Americans who were already unemployed. Kennedy was accused of being too concerned about what Southern politicians and voters thought of him, and that perhaps held back the measures that he passed. He even tried to get Martin Luther King to call off his Great March to Washington, for example. Economically, Kennedy had a number of successes, such as making $900 million available to businesses to create new jobs, giving grants to companies to buy high-tech equipment and train their workers to use it. But the new equipment sometimes meant that unemployment happened because fewer workers were actually needed. And many of the new jobs created were dependent on government spending, which made them vulnerable to spending cuts. In contrast, Johnson's Great Society also tried to make a better, fairer society, and in some cases had more success than the New Frontier. So again, the examiner can see that there's an argument that's flowing through the whole essay. We started by saying that Kennedy's New Frontier was important, but had limited success. Johnson's Great Society was more important. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were introduced during Johnson's presidency, and the Immigration Act ended racial quotas for people entering the USA. In education, he set up Operation Head Start, which gave money to schools and cities to provide a better education for the poor. And the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided major funding for schools. The Jobs Corps was introduced to help school leavers get jobs, and the Volunteers in Service America program was set up as a domestic version of the Peace Corps. In response to the problems in healthcare and poverty, he also raised the minimum wage, and he created a Housing Act to fund low-income housing, and a Model Cities Act was passed to clear slums. In addition, he set up Medicare to fund healthcare for the elderly and low-income families, and therefore the Great Society made an enormous impact on making America a better, fairer society. What's important here is that you can see that this answer is not simply just a list of facts, but each of the facts is explained with this was important because, this meant this led to this. In conclusion then, it's clear that Johnson's Great Society definitely made the greater impact on American society. It actually put into practice many of Kennedy's ideas that he was unable to do because politicians from the South were unsupportive. Johnson was a Southerner himself. He was a much more experienced politician, and he could therefore relate to the Southern politicians' concerns, and therefore was able to pass much more thorough and far-reaching reforms. And for that reason, his Great Society was more important in making America a better, fairer society. I hope that's been helpful, and feel free to ask any questions that you've got.